I hope you're all doing good. Am I audible to everybody?
Good morning, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, you're audible.
Please give me a confirmation that I'm audible.
Yeah, ma'am.
Can you give me a thumbs up if in case I'm audible to everyone?
Okay, ma'am. Okay.
Preet, Gurpinder, anybody? Can you see the screen? Okay. Thank you, Sadhna. Fine. So, welcome to today's class. We have been reading stories earlier in our previous classes. Okay. So today we are going to start again some other poems that are there. Okay. Fine. So in your syllabus, there is a segment where you have some more poems in your syllabus from Spots of Time, which is the book prescribed in your syllabus. We are going to firstly look at The Daffodils, that is there, a poem by William Wordsworth. Now, I wanted to know from some of you, if in case you know anything about William Wordsworth, when was he writing? Because it's essential that when we start to study a particular writer, we should emphasize on knowing a bit about the author as well. Okay. Can you share something about the author with me? William Wordsworth was writing in which time? Anyone? Is he a romantic poet? William Wordsworth actually was writing in the age romantic period of writing poetry, where he was actually there was a movement of poetry where almost all the people, writers who were writing, wanted to talk about. Yes, Nidita, please tell me.
Good morning, ma'am.
Nidita, you raised your
First
hand.
of all, so from what I know about Wordsworth is that he, like as you mentioned, like he was a
Nidita,
romantic poet and writer,
Nidita, you've
and
raised your
most of
hand,
his
beta. You're saying something. Your mic is unmute, but I don't know why I can't hear you.
am I audible now, ma'am?
Yeah, Nidita, could you come back again?
Good morning, ma'am.
Yes, good morning, beta. Please tell me.
So, ma'am, like as you mentioned, William Wordsworth, like he was a romantic poet. So, yeah, what I have understood from my past academic studies and everything about him is like he was mostly used to write about something that is related to nature or
Yes.
any kind of um, emotion, uh,
Hmm.
like uh, and he used to make sure that he makes the ordinary feel extraordinary in a way.
Yes.
So
Yes.
these are some like key points I remember from reading his poems as a child before.
Great. Um, okay. So this is actually correct. Thank you so much for bringing this. Okay. I want to also reflect upon it that when we talk about William Wordsworth here, or any other writer who's writing, I mentioned romantic period. Okay, there was a reason why I mentioned romantic period, because at that time in 19th century there were a lot of developments. Industrialization as a movement, as an event, was pretty prominent. So when you have industrialization, there were a lot of people who were replaced. Human beings were replaced by machines. So if you look at it, there were a lot of people who lost their jobs because they were replaced by machines. There were a lot of products that were made. The demand was less because there were not many people who were able to utilize the products. But because of industrialization, human beings had become very mechanical. Okay. Machines were given so much important, materialistic aspects of life were given much more important. Henceforth, romantic period of poetry, actually, like, which includes William Wordsworth, like writers, these were the writers who emphasized that we should be in sync, how human beings should be in sync with nature. Okay, they mentioned, they reminded people of how common things, common man, are so important, and how nature actually then for William Wordsworth was an inspirer, a teacher, a guide. So according to him, what he emphasized through his poetry, if you look at the title itself, this title of the poem is the Daffodils. Okay, when we are passing by, even today, if we look at it, why is it relevant for us to read poet like him in our syllabus, is because how often do we actually sit at home on an everyday life, look at the flowers that are growing around us, and pay attention, or maybe just rejoice in the fact that today the flower is blooming. It is in itself a thing of beauty and joy that we should be paying attention to. Okay, so Wordsworth is actually now walking around, and he's looking at the daffodils which are growing, and he's trying to observe the beauty of nature in this poem particularly. Okay, and how that beauty in itself is actually emphasizing on the poet feeling happy as an individual, feeling more alive, being amidst nature, and nature then in that case in return inspiring him. So when you start to observe around you, what are the things that are there, you actually start to be more present in the present time. You are not flipping back and forth in the future or maybe in the past about the worries that are there. That is what is very much important for the human spirit to be alive, to be feeling, that how solitude and reflection become very important pointers for us. It's only when you are actually sitting silently amidst nature that you realize that how important it is for self reflection. Okay, I hope by now I'm clear. If in case I'm clear, you can give me thumbs up. Okay, so let's look at it, that I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud is actually one of the most celebrated poems that are there for romantic age, and it actually captures the movement's fascination that is there with nature, with memory, with the transformative power of imagination that one has. And the poem is actually encountering poet's experience with nature. It's a golden it's a field full of golden daffodils that is there, that the poet actually sees around, and that brings emotional renewal and the spiritual enrichment for the poet when he's passing by and looking at it. Okay, now please remember, as students of literature, sometimes we usually, actually not sometimes, but usually we have a practice of saying that the speaker of the poem is saying something like that. Okay, it's not essential that the speaker of the poem will always be the poet. Sometimes it could be some other persona. I might be choosing to write like a male character. So then it will always be the speaker. But in this particular poem, Wordsworth is writing with a subjective approach. So hence the speaker of the poem is also the poet himself. Okay, that's something that we should keep in mind. Now, here in this poem, we also find that Wordsworth is in that case talking about nature as a source of healing and inspiration. So, while we have always talked about Wordsworth as an inspirer, as a teacher, as a guide, here it is actually nature as a source of healing and inspiration. While writing your answers in your answer scripts, please make sure for this poem, while you write nature, N would be capitalized because nature is always personified in Wordsworth's poetry. Okay, so when we talk further about it, we understand that Wordsworth actually is positioning nature as a comforting companion in the poem, and he is actually offering solace to the lonely mind that is there. And the poem opens up with speaker who is wandering as a lonely cloud, highlighting the emotional isolation that he has. However, there is sudden sight of the daffodils which changes everything. So while the poet was actually feeling isolated in this world which is full of materialistic aspects of life, industrialization that is impacting the lives of millions of people around that time, he looks at daffodils which are golden, and he looks at them, and that sight itself brings him vibrant energy. There are lines, I will give you the exact terms that he uses in the poem. He says, fluttering and dancing in breeze. It's almost like he's given Daffodils are personified characteristics, human-like characteristic, and this is what awakens joy within him. So this interaction reflects that there is a romantic belief system, that nature has a power to elevate the human spirit, and it also provides emotional refuge to the human beings. Okay, so daffodils henceforth become a symbol of joy and continuity. Okay, they are not merely flowers in this poem. Okay, um, so we understand that there is symbolism of harmony, symbolism of hope, and then abundance of life. So Wordsworth is using imagery of numberless stars that are there to emphasize that there is continuity and beauty. This comparison also helps us elevate the flowers from a very local scene that is there around us to a cosmic spectacle, which suggests that nature is actually expressing divine order, also timelessness that is there. Okay, so if you look at poetic imagination and memory, these two things again become very important for us. Although the encounter has ended, he has gone to the fields, he looked at it, the encounter has ended, but the daffodils which are there, they have remained with the poet in his memory, and that is what brings him a bliss of solitude. Now, please understand the concept of how the poet is indirectly moving from isolation, loneliness. Okay, so these are terms which are tricky, but they mean different. Isolation is one word and solitude is another. Isolation is when you are alone, you're not liking that state of isolation, you want to be with the people, but solitude is when you want to, when you are comfortable spending time within yourself. So in this poem, you find there's a journey that the poet has taken from isolation when he started his walk to solitude, and at the same time you also find that how the memory of the mood changes of the poem from a very vacant and pensive mood to the joyous joy that is being brought by daffodils. Okay, so the recollection that you have of daffodils is actually uh, restoring the inner joy that the poet is having. So there is an interplay between memory and imagination that you find, which are also hallmark of Wordsworth's poetry, because he believed that mind has the ability to revisit natural beauty. Okay, whenever you want, you can think of the natural beauty, and which will deepen your emotional understanding about life. Okay, now let's look at, I've already talked about the key imagery of daffodil that is there. There are continuous waves that are mentioned, inward eye that is there. Okay, there are some other poetic devices that you find, simile, personification, rhyme scheme, mood and tone. We'll discuss all of this as well. What you see on the screen, you can keep reading it and keep listening to what I'm mentioning as well. These are two different things, but uh, please align yourself. Okay, so the PPT will be shared as well with you. Now in this poem you find the diction. Diction is Diction. Diction is the use of language that poet has. Okay, formally in English literature we use the term diction. Now the diction reflects that Wordsworth's aim is to make this poetry accessible for common man. He was not writing, unlike the previous age in 18th century, how people thought that poetry should be written only for the elite class, only people who have very good English, very difficult words should be utilized, only elite class of people should be able to read poetry. Contrary to that belief system, Wordsworth believed that poetry should be pleasing for everyone. It should be spontaneous flow of emotions, and hence he wanted poetry to be understood by common man. So you find that it's a rhythmic iambic tetrameter that he's using. He's using a rhyme scheme to create a musical quality that will actually mirror the dance of the flower when he says that the breeze was flowing and it was as if the daffodils are dancing. Okay, so the tone is very light, it's cheerful, it's reflective, it's capturing both spontaneity and encounter. It's also talking about the deeper tranquility that follows with understanding the daffodils. So as a romantic poem, you find that the poem is emphasizing on the spiritual value of nature. It's talking about intimacy between human mind and natural world. It's also talking about, third, the belief that beauty found in nature can actually shape moral and emotional life of human beings. Okay, so then what do we find? That the poem itself, the daffodil, becomes a metaphor for enduring relationship that is there between human beings and nature, a relationship that is capable of healing, of uplifting and inspiring human beings. Okay, now let's move to the next poem that is there, Ozymandias. Okay, do you know anything about Shelley? Anyone? Okay. Shelley was belonging to which age? Again, romantic poet, but writing very differently. His style of writing is unlike Wordsworth, though he's also talking about emphasizing on the concept of beauty. Now, what you see is in this image, Ozymandias, there's a statue that is there. Okay, it is broken. You see the environment that is there in the backdrop. We are going to come back to Ozymandias. It's actually a poem which talks about how everything that is there that takes birth on earth will eventually perish. There is nothing, you might be a king today, you might have all the power in the world, but it's not that you will not diminish. One day you will also diminish. Okay? We'll look at the poem further now. So Ozymandias was written by Shelley. Shelley has actually again emphasized on the concept of beauty. He in this particular poem he's talking about mortality and immortality. Now immortality is when you are alive, or the state where you say that he's Amar Ajar, but not whatever has taken birth in this lifetime will eventually be perishing or will actually be destroyed, including the pride that people have. So he's given us an example of Ozymandias, who was a great king, okay, in the poem, and how he also eventually had to his and statues or epigraphs that people make. You must have seen in India, it is a usual practice that once you die, you will still have a name of a table or a chair that is there in the temple. People engrave it on the walls, that post my death also people will come and see this. So post your death you will yourself not be there, and how will you derive pleasure that what happens post your death, because you are not there to witness it. So he's talking about these aspects of life. Okay, so it's a powerful sonnet. Firstly, you have to understand that it is a sonnet which is actually talking about exploring the impermanence of human power. There is an arrogance of a ruler that is actually utilized to give this example. He's talked about inevitable decay of political and material achievements as well, that you have so many people who try and look at it that if I have become so and so powerful person, that nobody will be able to harm me. Mind you, this is what he's trying to emphasize, that even if in case you have a lot of power, even if in case you have a lot of money, material achievements that you've got, it does not take this fact away that you will also perish, you will also be meeting death. Okay, so through the image of a shattered statue that you saw in the beginning, you find, and there is a vast desert around that statue. So he's presenting a profound mediation on time, on history, on human vanity. You must have seen that there are so many people who build their own statues now in down south India. You have Bollywood stars whose temples have been made. In these temples, so till the time they are alive, obviously everybody would remember you. But post your death, how many years will somebody remember you because of the work? And if it is about the work that you've done that you will be recognized, it's not the power or the materialistic pleasures of life that you enjoyed that you were remembered. Okay, so there is an illusion that human beings have of power and human arrogance that is there. So at the heart of the poem you find that there is a figure of Ozymandias, who was a very tyrannical ruler who once boasted that there is an unmatched might that he has. He proclaimed that, there's a line that I would like to read out and state in front of you. He said, "Look on my works, you mighty and despair." So that's where he's claiming that he has done so much. And this proud inscription that is there that he talks about, it contrasts very sharply against the actual scene that is described by a traveler. The traveler who actually is passing by and sees the statue of Ozymandias, he finds that it is in ruins, it is fragmented. You find the broken pieces which were lying, there's emptiness around it. Okay, so the irony is very striking that Ozymandias actually commanded future generations to marvel at his greatness when he got the statue built. But what remains actually in reality is merely a colossal wreck. Okay, there's nothing much that is there to people, for people to praise the beauty of praise the statue also that he built. So Shelley is using irony to emphasize on how rulers often overestimate that they have a legacy. They believe that their power is eternal, but it is actually truly no. not like that. Okay, so the ravages of time also is again another theme, that time is portrayed as an ultimate force that will actually erase all the human accomplishments that are there. And once there was a grand statue, that was there of Ozymandias, which also lies broken in the sand now. It is shattered visage that is there, and still bears the sculptor's skill, but it is not the king's authority. It is the sculptor who he is praising, Shelley is praising, that it is the sculptor who should be given a lot of skill that he had, that he was able to build that. But the king's authority is gone now from that statue, if you look at it. And Shelley is suggesting that no matter how immense or intimidating you are with the political power that you currently hold, but it cannot endure the relentless passage of time that is there. So the imagery that you have of lone and level sands that are there, that is stretched far away. It enforces the idea that nature and time eventually will claim everything. Okay, and hence you find that in the third pointer I've mentioned the fragility of empire is also discussed. Okay, whatever I'm discussing here, it's actually in sync with whatever you see on the screen as well, just the words may be a little different. Okay, so then we talk about art versus power. Interestingly, Shelley is also hinting at the art that is there, that not empire is what endures. Okay, he's mentioning that Ozymandias' political authority has crumbled down. He talks about the sculptor's artistry, which survives in expressing the details that are there carved on the stone, where you find that on the stone it is still written the sneer of cold command that is there, which was actually very much representative of authority that Ozymandias was having. So the sculptor is understanding Ozymandias' pride, cruelty that is there. It captures them more truthfully than the king's own self proclamation. So imagine the way you are being perceived by the artist has become so important here. And therefore, you find that the poem is subtly elevating the enduring power of artistic expression over the political monument that has been created. I mean, I don't know if the example would be right, but in India also you find a lot of statues built now dedicated to certain political figures as well. So we must rethink about it, that when are they, what are they actually representative of? Do we really need them, and how will they survive the passage of time? And where are we actually looking at? Okay, so then let's look at structure, voice, and irony that is there in the poem. We understand that the sonnet is is used as a form. So instead of focusing on a romantic love, Shelley is actually looking at a frame of a political and philosophical critique here. The narrative is actually layered. So you have a poet, you have a traveler, you have a statue inscription that is there. And these three things are actually creating the distance, which emphasize that the lost grandeur that is there, the forgotten history of the king that you find. Okay, so this is the storytelling device that is reinforcing the theme of disintegration and also fading of memory, so that other people will not eventually remember you also. And there is dramatic irony that you find as a literary figure of speech, which is central to the poem. Ozymandias wanted his words to inspire awe, yet you find that they are provoking contempt here, they are provoking reflection, they're also reflecting on emptiness of tyrannical ambition that people have. Okay, and the poem in itself is a very popular poem with a universal message that it gives. It's not just about an ancient Egyptian king, it is actually about a timeless warning about the fragility that human actually achievements have. There is futility of political arrogance that people have. There are kings, empires, and monuments which might rise and fall, but time is one thing that will never be defeated. Okay, so the poem is henceforth inviting the reader to reflect on the nature of ambitions that you have. You might have a lot of ambitions, and where is it all going to lead? So how important is it to be remaining human with the things that kindness, and other values, human emotions should be given. Okay, so the legacy of power is discussed here. The humble truth is given to you that greatest rulers also cannot escape oblivion. Everybody at certain point will be forgetting you. Okay, Here is again a list of poetic devices clearly marked out for you. How he's using irony, alliteration, enjambment, mood and tone of the poem also we have talked about. So please make sure that while you are writing your answers, you are very clearly marking out, bringing out the important segments here at least, okay? Fine. Is it clear to everybody? Okay. These details again about Ozymandias will also be there. This is a concluding argument that I just gave you. Please give me hands up if in case you are okay with it for now. Any doubts? Okay. Samriddhi, please put your question. You've raised your hand. Samriddhi, any doubt? Okay. Now understand in today's lecture the three poems that I've taken up. First was Wordsworth's poetry, which was more or less a mediation that was there of nature, around the nature. The rhyme scheme was there. Look at the length of the poem, the daffodils as well, closely. The second poem, Ozymandias, is a sonnet that you find. Now the third one is an ode. Okay. It's significant for us to observe how these writers are writing in the Romantic period, different kind of genres that they are using. Okay, so while you begin to write your answer, please write one paragraph for yourself on what is an ode, what is a sonnet, what is a lyric. So a lyrical poem that is there. Find out is there a pattern that Wordsworth has been using as well or not. Okay. Now, when we talk about, I'm sorry, when we talk about the next poem that we have, it is Ode to Autumn. Now, autumn is what kind of a season? In India, we follow different kind of seasons as well, but look at the Western concept of autumn. Autumn is experienced in India as well. But what does autumn represent? Anyone? Is it talking about regeneration where the plants are falling, or you have new leaves coming in?
May I speak, ma'am?
Yes, please.
So, ma'am, in my opinion, autumn is just like, you know, having a rebirth in general. Like you shed off the old layers and you welcome the new season and let
Yes.
it embrace you with new ideas, different colors. Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct, Nirita. And it's very important that you are able to produce this answer and this understanding of autumn, where you embrace the newness that is there, shedding off your old layers, as you mentioned. It's important because you've been able to experience it because you're around nature, you're observant of it. Henceforth, it is not just any random change of seasons that is there. So, as a literature student, fantastic job done at that place. Okay. Yeah, now let's look at John Keats, who is a writer who's written this to autumn. He's chosen that particular season, particularly because he's talking, it's actually one of the finest odes that you read, okay? Then it is actually helping you, the poem in itself, the title also elevates the ordinary season of autumn into a symbol, and it becomes symbol of fullness, a symbol of maturity, the quiet beauty of life's final stages that you have. So unlike many other romantic poems that you have, this focus is on intense emotions, on the dramatic landscape that is there, and this ode finally finds significance in calmness, in ripeness. So everything ripes, okay? There's a season when fruits will finally reach a stage where they will be ripened. So there's a natural rhythm of time that is there, and anything that is there has to be you will be able to enjoy any fruit for that matter. You find that there is a celebration of ripeness and fulfillment that is there in the poem. Okay, at its heart, we find that the poem is talking about abundance that is there. So Keats is presenting autumn not as a time of decline, but as a season of rich fulfillment. The opening stanza that you have of the poem is actually talking about overflowing with the images of ripening fruits that are there, swelling gourds that are there. He's talking about maturing sun that is there. So there is lush description that is creating a sense of completeness, harmony that is there between nature and time is reflected to you. And autumn becomes a metaphor for peak of human life. So the moment when you find that there is one person who has gathered experience and achieved inner maturity, that is the moment that is being celebrated in the poem. So there is personification of autumn. In the previous poem as well, we found that Ozymandias was becoming symbolic, daffodils became symbolic, daffodils were personified as well. Here autumn has been personified, and on that line I think Keats is somewhat more close to Wordsworthian interpretation as well. Okay, though the way they are approaching the season here and daffodils nature over there are two very different ways in which both the poets are working. So Keats is personifying the season as a female figure which is engaged in daily labor, as if she's a lady who's sitting carelessly on a granary floor watching over the harvest that is happening, that is around her. Patiently she's gleaning in the field. Okay, and this domestic, almost intimate portrayal that is there, it actually shifts the poem from a description of nature to a very gentle mediation that is there of human existence. So autumn then appears very calm, composed, and deeply connected to the land that is there. And through this imagery, Keats is suggesting that beauty also lies in slowness, in labor, in stillness that is there. Mind you, students, there is another very interesting essay that I would suggest you to read over here. It's called On Doing Nothing. In today's time, when we find, and remember, in those times as well, when Keats was writing, industrialization was still a thing. So many people were like, people are working tirelessly, having a monotonous life every day, but they don't know what is actually the end result. Even today, we are busy in metro life, but do we have time to just sit still and do nothing? Will we still be completely enough in ourselves if in case we just sit still? That is what is actually the poem is emphasizing on. So there is a transition from sound to silence in the poem as well. You find that there are three stanzas that are there which actually chart a movement from visual richness that is reflected initially to the auditory delicacy that is provided to the readers or the okay. So the final stanza that you find, it is instead of mourning the loss of summer that is just passed by, it is celebrating the subtle music of autumn that is there. So you find that there are sounds of crickets, there are sounds of lambs, there are gnats and birds that are preparing for migration. Now, this attention to the small sound reflects that Keats is having a belief system that every stage of life will carry its own beauty. Silence is not emptiness, it is softer and most reflective form of music that is there. Okay. Just give me a moment. Okay. I'm sorry about that. Fine, let's continue. So then if you look at it further, now when we talk about autumn here, we've looked at the cycle of life, celebration of autumn that is there. I hope you had time to look at uh, the screen that is there in front of you. It's talking about the details that are there. So there is, we were talking about how the poem is actually talking about the transition of sound to silence that is there. You also find that there is a tension that sound is actually here reflecting on Keats' belief that, silence is not emptiness. Okay, so there is there is a theme in the poem of transience and acceptance. So unlike many other romantic poets who are lamenting the passing of time, for example, if you look at Ozymandias as well, it's not he's not mourning the loss of time that is there, but it's at the same time he's very strongly talking about time as a major force that will perish everything. Keats here is actually accepting it with calm and dignity that change is inevitable. And you find that autumn is foreshadowing winter, just as maturity is foreshadowing decline. And Keat actually refuses melancholy. He instead finds value in each moment that is there, and the ode becomes a mediation of cycle of life, growth, fulfillment, and eventually fading. So there is a cyclic process that you find here. Just like how all human beings, there is child, eventually you become a young person, then you become an adult, then you grow old. Okay, and if you know of it, ideally when you grow too old, you actually begin to, you firstly lose all your teeth, and then you again, like a child baby, you have your tooth coming in again. Okay, so, so it's a whole cyclic process that he's trying to talk about. And the tone of the poem, if you look at it, it is actually serene. It's acknowledging that there is loss, which is a natural part of life's rhythm that is there. Okay. Then there is sensory image of poetic craftsmanship that is there. Um, Let me just change the slide. Hmm. So he's actually giving you sensory details. In the beginning, I mentioned that the poet is actually giving you a lot of visual imagery. There is auditory imagery as well towards the end. Please make sure you understand 5 types of imageries that are there, and write a good paragraph for yourself, which you can utilize in writing answer for this poem particularly. So you find there is visual richness that is there. Tactile imagery is also there. Okay. The imagery of, so auditory delicacy that is there. So these are actually creating a vivid world in this particular ode, where you find the language is very slow, it's musical, it's reflective, it actually mirrors the pace of the season that is there. Okay, so there is a structured progression that you have of the stanzas, that it is as if there is ripeness to labor to the song that is there, which is actually creating a emotional and symbolic arc for the readers. Okay, so To Autumn is actually not just a nature poem. You find that it is a philosophical reflection on human experience, and through its rich imagery, you find that there is tranquility in tone in the poem. It's teaching us acceptance, it's teaching us presence, it's teaching us appreciation, and Keat is actually transforming a very simple season into a symbol of life's final beautiful maturity that is there. And it's reminding readers that even in decline, there is harmony, there is warmth, and there is meaning. Okay. Now we have some more poems left, but I'm not sure how much time are we left with. Do we have some more time? Okay. Can we do one more poem? Okay. Now this poem, where in the beginning of the lecture when we were talking, I talked about the speaker of the poem is so symbolic and so important for us as readers. Now this is another poem which has been written by Robert Browning, and you can, I would like you to just observe that there is a lady who's there. This is a painting, actually a real painting that was there, um, and it is of a duchess. Now if you look at it, please observe the nuances, the aesthetics that are there, of how her expression is there, how she's dressed. Okay. Now this is a poem written by Robert Browning, and he's talking about My Last Duchess, where it's a dramatic monologue. The speak of the poem is very different persona than the poet himself. Okay. Now, now it's significant for us to firstly understand what is dramatic monologue. It's a monologue where one person speaks and there is a silent listener around you. Okay. Now, My Last Duchess was written in 1842, which is again a dramatic monologue form, different form for you to remember and write a paragraph on. It's actually revealing the psychology of the speaker, and the speaker of the poem is a duke of Ferrara, who's actually writing, who's speaking certain words, and you understand what is the personality of that duke. And the backdrop that you have of the poem is that of Renaissance, where aristocracy was there. People were, so in the poem, the writer is exploring how power, control, patriarchy, art, objectification of women are used to be in those times. And Browning is using irony, symbolism, and linguistic subtlety, where he exposes that Duke was an authoritative character, and simultaneously is also talking about societal structure that is there, where you find how people are dominating. Okay, I mean, these ideologies were dominating the individual. You find there is dramatic monologue and psychological portrait here. So the poem is unfolding as Duke is escorting a missionary through the palace. He pauses before a portrait of his late Duchess. Okay, the form allows that Browning is exposing Duke's character indirectly. The Duke is having a speech where he's actually talking about revealing that he's very obsessive. There is an obsessive need that he has to control. There is jealousy that you find in his character portrayal. You find there is inability to tolerate independence of spontaneity that his wife actually used to um, have. So there are phrases which are like, I gave command, then all smiles stopped together, which imply that there's a chilling understatement that he was the one who orchestrated her death. He was the one who gave instructions to ensure that his wife is killed. So the Duke is having all of this said in a very casual tone, which means that killing of wife or giving such orders, using power to over people was actually normalization of patriarchal violence that was there. You also find that there is an entitlement of aristocratic men that you find here. Okay, so this is a poem which talks about power, it's talking about possession, it's talking about patriarchal authority. You find Duke is also seeing Duchess not as a human being, but as a possession. So my wife is my possession. It's actually symbolized through the framed portrait that is there behind a curtain when he draws it aside. So there is he has a complaint that she was too soon made glad. You know, other people would come in and then they would very easily make her happy, too easily impressed. And this is something that reflects that he's insecure as a person. This is also reflecting that there's a desire for exclusive admiration that he should have. He cannot bear that she was smiling at other people, be it a servant, be it a sunset that she would look at and smile. A simple act of courtesy also was misunderstood by the man. Okay, the poem is henceforth exposing a worldview for us in which woman's worth actually lies in if you are obedient, if you are silent, if you are showcasing a controlled behavior. Okay, so the Duke's arrogance is rooted in class privilege. He's a noble man. He assumes that his wife should act according to the status that is there because she's a duchess. Okay, in the poem you also find that there is a description of art, aesthetics, and objectification. Okay, you find that Duke is valuing more art more than the life itself. He is actually boasting of a painter, Fra Pendolf, who was also the sculptor, Claus of Innsbruck, who's been mentioned in the poem, and he's displaying his collection that he has of the trophies as well. So the Duchess also becomes an object that is then in the gallery with the poem, with the portrait that he's got. She becomes the perfect artwork for him. Because as a perfect artwork, she's beautiful, she's obedient, incapable of defying his authority because now she's hanging on the wall as a with a portrait that is there. So Browning is critiquing the aestheticization of women, objectification of women, and he's suggesting that patriarchal society prefers that women can be seen as objects rather than individuals. In this poem, henceforth, you find that there is irony and how Browning is critiquing the Duke. Although the Duke is actually presenting himself as a noble person who's been wrong, because the Duke, there is a silent listener who has come as a somebody who is coming for the second match for Duke to again remarry another lady, and that is the person who is listening to how the Duke thinks of living life, right? So Browning is skillfully using this irony, which is ensuring that readers are perceiving him as a very cruel, insecure, and tyrannical person. And his attempt is that there's a control that is there of the Duke in the narrative that you find, which reveals that there's a flawed psyche that this character has. You find the envoy, and by extension, the reader is actually recognizing that there is a threat that is there in the Duke's embedded speech. He concludes, ultimately, you find that there is an artwork that he is reflecting on. He's talking about a bronze statue of Neptune taming a seahorse. Now, this particular worldview that you find here symbolically talks about his worldview, where men dominate and women, like the seahorse or the duchess, could be tamed. Now, with the themes that are there of control, of jealousy, and violence, the poem is presenting the idea that power will actually be will legitimize violence. Okay, so you cannot tolerate equality in relationships. He is demanding submission. He is jealous, and his jealousy is extending beyond the romantic insecurity that he has to a very basic fundamental fear that he has of losing control over his possession that is there. His wife becomes his possession. And the calm and controversial tone that you find in the poem, he describes Duchess' fate that intensifies the horror. The tyranny is portrayed as a refined, culturally sanctioned, and aesthetically framed thing here. So the setting of the poem that you see is a Renaissance setting which mirrors the Victorian morality that was there. So though it is set in Italy, Renaissance time, the poem is actually written in Victorian England. Subtly, it is actually critiquing the Victorian values there of the time regarding women, regarding marriage, regarding property that was there. And the story is being placed in a distant time and place where Browning could safely explore the issues that are there of patriarchal oppression. He's talking about silencing the women that remain relevant in his own society. Okay, so the poem is bringing to the readers a brilliant psychological and social critique. It's talking about aristocratic conversation that is there, and Duke and Browning, through the Duke, the poet Browning is actually exposing the danger that is there of absolute power. It's talking about the patriarchal control that people have. It's talking about the tragic consequences that are there of treating the women as objects rather than individuals. And the poem henceforth remained timeless for its exploration of toxic masculinity. Okay, he's talking about ownership and the chilling ease with which violence can be rationalized for those people who are actually holding the authority. Okay, the mood and tone, all of this we have talked about. Okay, you can still have a look at the screen and see for yourself. If in case there are any doubts, do let me know. So for this poem particularly, you must try and look at dramatic monologue as a poem. Okay. Post this, I think we are left with some more things, some more poems probably, which we'll take up in the next lecture. All right. So do you have any doubts? Samriddhi, you have your raised hand. Samriddhi? Okay, fine. Fine. Thank you so much for today's class. I'll send you the summary in the chat box. Please just hold on for one more minute. PPT, Manmeet, I can send you the PPT right away. I'll just send it. Okay. In the chat box, I'm sharing whatever we have done today in the notes form, in the summary form. If you need notes as well, do let me know. I can share the notes as well. Okay. Okay. And in the chat box, please copy from there, or maybe in the class group also, I'll share the summary. Okay. So this is all that we have covered up today. I'll share the PPT today itself. Okay. Right now. All right. Thank you so much, everybody.